Tonight we turn to the problem of agricultural policy. And again, I want you to think of this in terms of some of the core problems that we laid out at the beginning of the class, and also the sort of background historical trajectory of American public policy. Thinking it again in terms of the sort of dilemmas and contradictions and challenges of crafting public policy in a market economy. What we emphasized at the outset, and we'll pick up on, in a specific policy arena today, is the way in which public policy is expected to make markets work more efficiently or to mop up after their failures. At the same time, public policy is often asked to provide what an economist would call public goods and services, that is, those things that the market won't on its own provide. And across the modern era, I think American agriculture and agricultural policy offers some really potent exhibits of these problems and of these kinds of solutions. There is, in the history of American agriculture, particularly in the early years of the 20th century, a sort of fundamental failure of neoclassical economics, where supply and demand meet. But it's an unusual failure because it stems from not the monopoly problem, which is when you have one seller and all these disorganized consumers, but it's from the opposite, what economists call monopsony. That is, your sellers are completely disorganized and have trouble maintaining their prices. So commodity agricultural prices have been extraordinarily volatile really since the end of the Civil War. And as a result, a lot of public policy, even in very small forms, has been aimed at trying to organize those markets more efficiently and to organize the actors in them. And this is why in the agricultural economy you have such a prevalence of things like cooperatives and marketing boards and that sort of thing. And so on the one hand, you have public policy in agriculture aimed fundamentally at establishing efficiency in markets which are notoriously inefficient. The second problem, which I think is particularly well laid out in what we read in preparation for tonight, is the way in which policy is asked to do things that the market cannot do. That is, to pick up the public interest where the market fails. Think of things like the collapse of family farming, the exhaustion or degradation of soil, today or in the Dust Bowl days of the 1930s, and the environmental threats that are posed by agricultural waste or agricultural chemical runoff. And so if the first problem is efficiency, I think the second one, which our speakers will speak to very powerfully today, is the one of sustainability in the sort of broadest sense of the word. My final sort of introductory point would be that once again, we have, from an historical perspective, an arena of public policy that was fundamentally defined by the response to the Depression in the 1930s. And so again, you have that sort of New Deal moment marking a critical turning point where the federal role in this area is invented, and much of the policy debate since then has really been focused on whether the New Deal did too much or too little in its intervention in agricultural markets. We also, and again our speakers will touch on this, have yet another policy which is embedded in that uniquely American tangle of jurisdictional responsibility from the local, in this case county, state, and federal responsibilities. So today we welcome three guests who will speak to this and who are in different ways involved in a sort of fundamental rethinking of agricultural policy. So what I'll do is I'll do a quick introduction of all three. Do you want to come up so you can raise your hand as I introduce you? The presentation tonight is going to be a little bit different. We're not going to have a sort of formal at the podium with the slides. Our speakers are all going to just sort of run across the table and speak a little more briefly from the table, and then we'll move on to our Q&A. So I'd like to welcome Fred Kirschenmann. Fred is a longtime national and international leader in sustainable agriculture. He's a distinguished fellow at the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State, president of the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture in New York, and a professor in the Iowa State Department of Religion and Philosophy. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Chicago and has written extensively about ethics and agriculture. He served on the USDA's National Organic Standards Board and the National Commission on Industrial Farm Production. In 2001, he received the 7th Generation Research Award from the Center for Rural Affairs for his work on sustainability. Laura Krouse owns Abbey Hill Farms, a 72-acre farm near Mount Vernon, north of here, that produces heirloom seed corn and is also home to a 200-family CSA, Community Supported Agriculture organization. In 2007, Laura was the recipient of the Spencer Award for Sustainable Agriculture, honoring those who have contributed to the stability of the family farm in Iowa. Off-season, Laura provides conservation education to women landowners through a project of the Women in Food and Agricultural Network called Women Caring for the Land. Laura is also chair of the Linn County Soil and Water Conservation District. She holds BS degrees in agronomy and agricultural business from Iowa State. Francis Thicke owns and operates Radiance Dairy Farm in Fairfield, Iowa. He previously served with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington as a national program leader for soil science. He's also served in the Iowa Environmental Protection Commission and was appointed to the Iowa Food Policy Council by former Governor Vilsack. Dr. Thicke holds a PhD in agronomy and soil fertility, and he's been a frequent speaker at conferences and workshops in Iowa and across the nation on topics ranging from local food systems and economic development to organic farming practices. So let's start with a warm welcome. And Dr. Kirschenmann will kick things off.
All right, thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. And I'm going to try to start by providing sort of a context and a framework for understanding agriculture policy, because I think it's important in terms of understanding where we are today, where we've come from, and how we have looked at agriculture policy throughout history. And I'm sure all of you know this, but I think it's important for us to remember tonight that we've gone through, as a human species, 3 distinct periods, 3 distinct different types of agriculture, way in which we've, or I should say different ways in which we have fed ourselves. And the first, of course, was as hunter-gatherers. And when you think about it, that was a very efficient system. In fact, the return for energy in terms of food, in terms of energy in terms of food, the amount of energy that we got for the energy invested was the highest of any type of food system that we've ever had. And if you think about it, that's pretty obvious, because in a hunter-gatherer situation, you simply go out and gather the food or hunt for it, and you prepare it and you eat it. So it doesn't take a lot of energy to provide the food energy. And then about 10,000 years ago, we began to do agriculture, in which we domesticated plants and animals as our food source. That was a much lower energy return, because now you had to domesticate the animals, you had to cultivate the land, you had to develop the seeds, so you had to put a lot more energy in for the food that you got back. And you might say, well, why would we have done that? Well, as hunter-gatherers, it was a very mobile society, because you'd hunt out one place and then you had to move to the next place. And so agriculture made it possible for us to have settled societies for the first time. And then, we began to develop, communities, and et cetera. And then, and the agriculture which we developed in that first phase of that 10,000-year period was an agrarian agriculture. In other words, it was very community-based. It was localized. It was adapted to its local place. So it was what we call agrarian agriculture. And then, beginning about 1930, we developed the next form of agriculture, which most of us use the term industrial for it, because it operates on the basis of industrial principles. What we mean by that is that now we began to look at agriculture in an entirely different way. Rather than being located in communities, dependent on local ecologies, and returning the waste from the system, etc., we now began to look at agriculture like any other industrial economy, which is basically, industrial economies are all based on three basic principles: specialization, simplification, and economies of scale. And those were the principles that we now applied to agriculture. So, and we, there's a history behind this, of course, with any new evolution. And you can go back to about 1840 when Justus von Liebig wrote his essay on chemistry and the application of agriculture and physiology. And his basic concept, which he promoted in that essay, was that we needed to get away from what he called the laborious practice of manuring our soils, where you take the waste from the animals, etc., and put it back into the soil to maintain fertility. We didn't need to do that anymore because we had now discovered that there were synthetic inputs that we could use to replace that, and that would be much more efficient. And then in 1843, the first fertilizer factories were developed, and but again, farmers tend to, and I don't mean this just about farmers, probably all of us, we tend to, when things are working for us, we don't think very much about making changes, and you've got to change infrastructure and your culture and everything. And so farmers were very slow in adopting the industrial agriculture approach. And it wasn't really until after the Second World War that those industrial principles began to be applied on a very, very large scale. There's also important to remember that there was a reaction to this back in the mid-1900s. Because there were some agriculturalists who were looking at this development of shifting from these agronomic practices to these technological inputs, and they were saying this is the wrong thing to do because we're no longer going to be paying attention to restoring the biological health of our soil, and this is going to be a huge loss to future generations. Sir Albert Howard, who was one of the key thinkers about that, wrote two books, one in 1943 called An Agriculture Testament, and another one in 1947 called Soil and Health. And he referred to this, what he called the NPK mentality, as a form of banditry, because it was going to rob future generations of the kind of richness of soil that they were going to have, and he didn't use this term, but we would use it now as sustainable agriculture. And then you had people like Rudolf Steiner, who said, the whole science around this is wrong because it's very mechanistic, it's very reductionistic, and science has to be, you have to look at the full, all of the workings of nature in order to have a resilient agriculture. So it wasn't really then until after the Second World War that industrial agriculture began to be applied on a large scale. And as we all know now, for example, right now, 92% of our cultivated land in Iowa is in just two crops, corn and soybeans. So specialization, simplification, one of the reasons that Roundup Ready soybeans were adopted so rapidly by farmers because it simplified their weed management so they could go to larger operations, so economies of scale. And that's how our modern industrial system operates. So let's think about the history of farm policy in terms of this threefold movement within our agriculture system. And I'm going to talk now primarily just about agriculture policy in the United States. It's important to remember, I think, that in this agrarian agriculture, there was a great deal of resistance to any kind of uniform agriculture policy because farmers and other people saw agriculture as being rooted in their communities. So you couldn't have Washington, D.C. dictating agriculture policy on a kind of uniform basis. So there was a great deal of resistance to any kind of centralized policy. And probably the first federal policy that was instituted that had strong implications for agriculture was, of course, the Morrill Act of 1862, which established our land-grant universities. And that was intended to do research which would provide information for farmers which they could apply in whatever way they wanted to in their own settings. So in that sense, it was not seen as a huge threat. And it was designed to be for the, quote, industrial classes. So the assumption was that wealthy companies had their own funds, they could do their own research, but the general public needed to have a public research institution. And so the land-grant university system was established. And then, based on in part on the acceptance of that, President Lincoln also in 1862 established the first Bureau of Agriculture. And this was the first federal effort at establishing agricultural policy. And then 25 years later, in 1887, the Hatch Act was passed, which established for the first time the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So now for the first time, we had a national entity with a cabinet position that was going to explore agriculture policy. And then also probably one of the other things we should keep in mind, also going back to 1862, was the Homestead Act, which presumably made a lot of land available for people to do agriculture. The interesting thing, which even today I think a lot of people don't realize, that actually the general public didn't get a lot of the land. A lot of the land went to speculators. Railroads got 180 million acres out of the Homestead Act. So, but nevertheless, it did make more land available. Eventually, more people settled in the countryside and did agriculture. And then there was that period of time from roughly 1906 until 1915, which we regard as the golden era or the golden age of agriculture. And this was now when the principles of industrialization started to be recognized, and you had the beginnings of resources and fertilizers, etc., going into agriculture, and began to increase the productivity of agriculture. And it was a period of time when farmers had fairly good prices, and so again there was no need for agricultural policy in a sense, because things were working really well during that period of time. But then of course what happened, and here's a key thing that we need to keep in mind about agricultural policy, is you started to have surpluses. Farmers were producing more than the demand for those products. And so by 1920, you started to have a severe depression in agriculture in this country. And now there was a great tension about, what do we do about that? And in 1921, two people, George Peake and Hugh Johnson, they were executives of the Moline Plow Company, and they began to recognize that farmers in this depression now are not going to be able to buy equipment, and we need to do something about this. So they began lobbying for what they called the Equality for Agriculture Act, which they wanted to try to get passed. And that was the first time that within the history of agriculture policy, we started to talk seriously about parity, because that's really what it was about. How can farmers be on an equal basis with the rest of the economy in terms of their income so that they can sustain their farming operations? And they lobbied very heavily to get the Equality for Agriculture Act passed. They actually got Congress to pass it twice, in 1927 and in 1928, but both times it was vetoed by President Coolidge because he didn't think this was the direction we ought to be going in. And then of course in 1929, the Depression struck the entire economy, and now there was a huge concern throughout the United States about what do we do about this Depression era. And of course in 1933 President Roosevelt came into the picture, and he then gathered farm leaders together to come up with a farm plan for dealing with this Depression era. How do we begin to put together a federal farm policy that can meet these concerns around the farming population? And again, the goal of that and what they came up with was the Agriculture Adjustment Act, which then became the basis of farm policy, for a number of decades after that. And again, the goal of that was focused on parity. How do we make it possible for farmers, to have an equal income situation in relationship to the rest of the economy? And what the Agriculture Adjustment Act did was, in fact, to make the Secretary of Agriculture serve as a kind of CEO on the behalf of farmers. And so embedded in this was the free market principles that we heard about earlier, that in any free market economy, if you're in the business of manufacturing automobiles, you want to balance supply and demand, right? And so if you're the CEO of an automobile factory, And if you're starting to oversupply so that your supply exceeds the demand, then you're going to cut back on your production, lay off some people, whatever else you need to do until demand catches up with supply, and then you go back into production again. Well, there was a recognition in this farm plan that the farmers and President Roosevelt were together that farmers can't do that, because individually as farmers, if I as a farmer decide I'm going to cut back on my corn production because we're oversupplying the market, but other farmers don't do that, then I not only lose out on the price because the price is still going to stay down because they're just supplying too much, and I'm also going to lose from the reduction in production. So farmers are going to produce as much as they can in order to maintain, in order to work in the system. So this was a way now to have the Secretary of Agriculture try to balance that supply and demand in terms of public policy. And that was done in a number of ways. One was that there was a tax. The Agriculture Adjustment Act placed a small tax on the processors in order to be able to subsidize exports, so you could increase exports to get rid of that surplus, which had been developed in that golden age of agriculture. Secondly, there was an acreage control, so that the Secretary of Agriculture could determine that a certain percentage of farmland needed to be kept out of production, and then farmers were compensated for setting aside those agricultural lands. So this was across the board for all farmers, so then you reduce your supply that way. And the third was a government storage program, which came to be called the Ever Normal Granary, in which the government would provide storage for some of the land and provide farmers for at least a partial payment for that grain that went into storage, and then that would keep the price at a relatively stable basis. And then after the supply, after the demand caught up with supply, then the government would release that grain from storage and intended to stabilize the prices. It's interesting to note that by 1935, farmers received $573 million in government subsidies. So that was the beginning of subsidizing, farm activities in the interest of a more stable kind of agriculture. But like I say, it wasn't until after World War II that these industrial principles of specialization, simplification, economies of scale really were adopted at a large scale. And of course, the war also created a new market for agriculture. And so from 1941 to 1952, without a lot of government intervention, farm prices were at roughly 100 to 115% of parity. So again, these were good times. And I remember my father always saying the 40s were the good years. On our farm in North Dakota, that's when we expanded the farm, bought more land, and that was pretty typical of other farmers. And then in 1953, when Eisenhower became president, he appointed Ezra Taft Benson as the Secretary of Agriculture. And Ezra Taft Benson was opposed to high price supports and to direct government payments. And so he began to develop a new set of policies because he thought, and it was by that time it was also, there was a general concern about this because in the 1950s and 60s, taxpayers were now spending billions of dollars just in the storage program for the Ever Normal Grain storage program. So people were beginning to recognize that couldn't do this forever. And then in the Nixon administration, Earl Butz was appointed as Secretary of Agriculture. And Earl Butz determined that he was going to solve the problem by increasing exports and to adopt the industrial principles in a strong way within our federal agricultural policies. And so, as Secretary of Agriculture, and this was also at the time when the former Soviet Union needed, they were under a famine situation, and so in between 1972 and 1973, we actually exported 1/3 of our wheat production in this country to Russia, and that sucked out a lot of that surplus and began. It looked like Ezra Taft Benson, it looked like Earl Butz's strategy was going to work. Then, of course, a lot of things happened, which we can go into detail if you want, which changed all of that, and those export demands dropped off. We had an embargo on Russia because of our, political conflict with them, et cetera. But nevertheless, Earl Butz continued to be a strong proponent of the industrial principles. He determined that technology and economies of scale were what was going to have to solve our problems in agriculture. That famous phrase, which we've all heard, get big or get out, was the advice he gave to farmers. That's what you got to do. You adapt or die. Farming is the survival of the fittest, as he put it. So it was these very strong, this is an individualistic thing, and farmers have to figure out how they're going to do this and how they're going to survive. Interestingly enough, in 1977, Earl Butz and Wendell Berry had a debate which became very widely publicized. And Earl Butz, of course, was on the side of industrial agriculture. Wendell Berry, if you know any of his writings, was on the side of agrarian agriculture. And so that in itself, if we want to read that debate sometime, it gives you a perfect example of the kind of, where we were at that point and the tension between those 2 points of view. So then in 1996, we established the Freedom to Farm Act. And this was now the effort to free us from this long history of control on the part of the government and the Secretary of Agriculture, serving as the CEO. Let's free farmers from all of that so that they can simply operate in terms of the market. And the idea behind that was that in any free market economy, the people in the economy have to make their own adjustments. And so, again, if you're producing too many automobiles, you pull back on that, you do something else for a time until they catch up, and then you go back to do that. So the assumption behind the Freedom to Farm Act was that if we just free farmers from government control, and we'll do this on a gradual kind of basis and gradually reduce the subsidies to farmers, and then if the price of corn goes down, farmers will raise something else until the surplus gets taken care of, the price goes back up, and then they go back to raising corn again. Now, Darrell Ray, who is a policy person at the Center for Agriculture Policy at the University of Tennessee, and Darrell Ray has more clearly, I think, than anyone else articulated why the Freedom of Farm Act didn't work. And that was, if you're a farmer, he said, you don't have the option, if the price of corn goes down, to stop raising corn and raise something else. Because first of all, the market infrastructure doesn't provide for that. And in the second place, your whole investment as a farmer and in equipment and everything else is to raise corn. And you can't just suddenly go raise, fava beans or something else. So if the price goes down, instead of farmers going to raise something else, they're going to raise even more corn in order to make up for the lower prices. And that, of course, is exactly what happened. And then, as Darrell Ray says, when the prices go up, farmers are also going to try to raise more in order to make up for the time when the prices were low. So the Freedom to Farm Act really hasn't worked, and so we've had to come in with emergency funding, et cetera, just to bail farmers out. And so today we have a very huge subsidy program. So this is where we are now, and so now I want to just take a minute or two to help us think a little bit about the future, because one of the other things we have to prepare for now is a very different kind of future in all of this, because the industrial system of agriculture, specialization, simplification, and economies of scale, worked really well as long as you had cheap energy, as long as you had plenty of water, because our current industrial system uses an enormous amount of fresh water. 70% of our fresh water on this planet is used just for agricultural irrigation. And you have to have relatively stable climates. When you have 92% of your cultivated land in Iowa corn and soybeans, you consistently need to have climate that's favorable to corn and soybeans in order to maintain productivity. All of those three things are now in question as we move into the future. We know that the era of cheap energy is now over. Energy costs will continue to go up. The industrial system of agriculture is absolutely dependent on cheap energy. It's fossil fuel energy. It drives our current industrial system of agriculture. Our fertilizers, our pesticides, our farm equipment, the diesel fuel to operate the farm equipment, all of that is based on fossil fuels. So when fossil fuels go up, farmers' costs collectively throughout the farming operations go up. And so that's not likely to continue to function. Our fresh water resources were drawn down all across the planet at an absolutely unsustainable rate. The Ogallala Aquifer, which provides most of the irrigation water for the heartland, we've now drawn down by half just since 1960. So we can't continue to do that. And whatever you may think about climate change, greater instability in climates is pretty well agreed upon by all the scientists. So we're going to see more unstable climates, more droughts, more floods, more severe weather events. and highly specialized monocultures are particularly vulnerable to those kinds of weather activities. So the question now that we have to ask ourselves in terms of farm policy is what kind of farm policies should we now be thinking about to prepare for this new future that we're going to be moving into? And do we have a decade to prepare for this, or 2 decades? Probably not any more than that. So these are issues that I think we want to address tonight. The other thing that we have to pay attention to in all of this is what's been happening to our farm population. With this get bigger, get out kind of notion, and we still pride ourselves in, the fewer farmers that we have feeding the more people, this is somehow a heroic accomplishment. But the thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is where we are now. And here's, as of 2007, here are a couple of worrisome statistics for me anyway. We now only have 125,000 farmers who produce 75% of our total agricultural commodities. And 30% of those farmers are now over age 65, and only 5% are under age 35. So as we move into this new future with these new challenges, we have to begin thinking about where our human capital is going to come from to sustain agriculture. And so we need to be thinking about policies which make it possible for the next generation of young farmers to get access to land, to get access to affordable capital, and to get access to the kind of markets that give them the kind of return. And whether you want to think about that in terms of parity or in terms of simply sufficient return to pay for cost of production and a living, that's something we have to begin to develop, and I think farm policy has to play a role in that. And then finally, 2 things I think we have to absolutely think about for our future is how do we restore the biological health of our soil, because that's still going to be a fundamental resource that we're going to have in this new future. And then secondly, restore the biodiversity, because biodiversity ultimately, as any ecologist knows, is going to be essential to a healthy biological systems. And farms, in the last analysis, are not factories, they're biological organisms. And so if we have a continued loss of biodiversity, which we've had dramatic loss both in biodiversity and in genetic diversity, we're going to have to begin to have some policies that move us in this other direction. And so those are some of the things that I hope we can have a conversation about. I'll stop there.
How many farmers did you say?
125,000.
In where? In Iowa?
No, in the United States.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
125,000 farmers in the United States. That's like less than Cedar Rapids.
75%, right? Yeah.
75% of the
Of
food.
our total production, right? Yeah.
And how many are over 60?
30% are over 65, and 5% are under age 35.
You guys better go home and plant a garden. I'm not kidding.
See, we still say we have 2.2 million farmers. The problem is that statistic's based on a 1974 definition of a farm, which is anybody that produces $1,000 in gross sales, or would have produced $1,000 in gross sales if they had been in full production with the resources, the capability that they had, then they're a farm. But only 125,000 farmers now produce 75% of our food.
Well, my name's Laura Krouse, and I farm up around Mount Vernon. And I only have 72 acres. It's a very small farm, about 1/10 the size of a typical Iowa farm. And for 20 years, I was a professor at Cornell in biology. And finally, after 20 years of working both full-time as a teacher and full-time as a farmer, I got to quit my teaching job, and now I'm a full-time farmer and have been for a couple of years. And so it's pretty unusual to find someone who only has 72 acres who makes enough money to live. So I'm a little bit of an unusual case. When I think about how I make decisions about my farm, I use the model that's used by a group called Practical Farmers of Iowa, which is a group you might all want to look up. I think absolutely the smartest farmers and the most creative people I've ever met belong to Practical Farmers of Iowa. And certainly everything I know about farming, I've learned from those people. It's a group of farmers, and they're willing to share what they know and help other people farm well, which is fabulous. But the model that PFI farmers use for sustainability, we'd like to think of it as a three-legged stool. And if you have a three-legged stool, if all the legs aren't equally supported, the stool's going to fall down. So the 3 legs of the stool, the 3 things we have to be thinking about simultaneously are environmental or ecological sustainability, so we have to be able to keep that biological space, that ecosystem in that space functional forever, so that there's food forever from that space. We have to think about economic sustainability, so we have to make enough money for the farm family to live, and live means put money away for college, have health insurance, put money in a retirement account, live in a house that has good windows. All those things are required for living, and so that's a pretty significant amount of money. Think about what your family, how your family lives, and how much money it takes for your family to have all those things. It takes the same amount for a farm family. And the third leg of the stool is social sustainability or community. And for that, we need to think about our town, or the people, the community around us that support our farm and on whom we depend and who depend on us. And so you can think about that as that the farmer spends money in the town, the money circulates in the town, puts other people to work, provides other services in the community. The farmer pays property taxes, so there's a school. There are enough people in the towns to support churches, enough people in the town to support a gas station, maybe even enough people in the town to support a grocery store. And any of you from small town Iowa, you know that doesn't describe every town in Iowa. There are lots of places where you don't have that many people anymore. And so I like to think about the decisions I make on my farm fulfilling sustainability in all three of those areas. So I think, okay, how's this going to affect my ecosystem, how's this going to affect my bottom line, and how's this going to affect my community when I get ready to do something. So I thought I might tell you a little bit about my farm, some practical things about it, and then I'm going to tell you some of the weaknesses in my system and some of the things that I'm afraid of, and then some things I think I can do. So first about the farm, it's 72 acres, so that's about like 72 football fields. And when I bought it, it was bare land. I now have a house there and 2 sheds and a well. And I grow food for about 200 families in the Mount Vernon-Lisbon area, and also Cedar Rapids. Some people from Cedar Rapids are included in that, through a marketing model called community-supported agriculture. And that's where I grow food for these 200 families, and they subscribe to me or join my farm ahead of time. So they make the commitment to pay me up front for the groceries that I'm going to grow for them, and I make the commitment to provide food for them every week throughout the growing season. So my families get food from about the second week of June until Halloween, and so half of the families come on Monday nights, half come on Thursday nights, and they pick up essentially what is their 1/200th of what the garden produced that week. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty big garden. It's about 15 acres, and we grow just about everything you can grow in Iowa, except spinach. I just can't figure out spinach. Turns out everyone loves spinach too, so there's no end of griping for that phenomena. But I also have just last year built a giant plastic unheated hoop house. So a building that's made out of big metal hoops and covered with thick plastic, clear, so the light shines in. And we plant crops on the floor inside that building, and then we're able to grow things either earlier or later in the season. So this year I was able to sell 35 shares to 35 families who then got produce from me in November and December. So we had our last delivery right before Christmas, and we were able to have lettuce and Swiss, all the beautiful vegetables out of the greenhouse, all leafy vegetables that were lovely for Christmas. So that's my primary operation, is the CSA garden. But I also grow a kind of corn that's very interesting. It's been on this farm since 1903. In 1903, the grandpa of the people I bought the farm from, a man named Mr. Neal, went to the World Corn Exposition in Chicago, and he bought some champion kernels of corn, and he brought them home to his farm in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and he started a little seed corn company. And it wasn't uncommon in 1903 for very small seed corn companies, perhaps maybe every 10 miles, probably there would be a farmer who would have a seed corn company. And they would select for seed that would be very locally adapted, so it fits that ecosystem, those climate conditions, those soils, and the uses that those farmers have for that corn. And so this farm family started a variety in 1903, the Neal family, and they kept it going till 1988, when I came along and purchased the farm, and now I keep the variety going also. So it's been grown on the same land 6 years. This will be the 107th year that it's been planted there. And that's quite unusual. Most farmers in all the developed world, the United States certainly, grow hybrid corn, which is corn that's been bred in such a way to produce superior offspring, much like you would take a mother dog, certain genetics, and a father of certain genetics, and you kind of make a pretty good guess that the baby is going to be better than either parent alone. That's the same thing that's done with corn, and almost all farmers plant that, what would be the baby of that cross. That's called hybrid corn. My corn is not like that, and so farmers can save seed from my corn, and it'll produce true year after year after year, so they'll always get the same variety. It turns out that it's really a good corn for feeding cows. It has real high digestibility and really high protein, and it tastes good. And turns out cows like stuff that tastes good, and so a lot of my customers are people who milk cows, dairy farmers, because dairy farmers certainly above everybody else want their cows to eat a lot of food and be happy and have a lot of babies. And so they're very interested in finding top quality feed. So those are my two primary crop enterprises. I also have some hay on the farm for the land that is actually being rotated through the garden rotation. I grow alfalfa hay. And if you came to my farm, you'd see lots of soil conservation and water quality practices in place. So certainly one of my very best things I have is a restored upland wetland. So we managed to get almost all the drainage off of my farm and about that much more drainage off of the neighbors' farms to pass through a little wetland that we constructed. And it was a 1 acre wetland. It takes the runoff off of 125 acres of farmland. We put 2 acres of restored prairie around it, and as you know, prairie plants have very deep roots, very good at sucking nutrients out of the soil. And what we found with that wetland is we put a monitoring well at the bottom where we can collect water from the floor of the wetland, so it's soaked all the way through and it's headed down to the aquifer. And when we check that water, it has no detectable nitrogen and no detectable phosphorus. So that's a really great thing. It's very simple treatment to make sure that very clean water leaves my farm. And it's actually the thing I'm most proud of. We also plant in the direction so that we slow down the flow of water off the field. We use lots of cover crops, which are crops that you plant specifically to feed the soil food web. You don't intend to feed cows or feed people, but rather you intend to feed the organisms that live in the soil. So they don't pay very well. So that's not a money-making enterprise when you grow cover crops, but ultimately you produce better soil, which produces better crops with fewer inputs, and so it does pay. It takes a little longer to show the payback, though. So it's a pretty nice place. People who come there, Sue's sitting here, she was at my farm yesterday, she said, oh, this is so pretty. It's like solid ice everywhere, but it's pretty. It's really nice. So, pretty idyllic. But there are some weaknesses, and there are some things that concern me. And after 2009, which was absolutely the most horrendous weather of my entire farming career, I am not looking forward to climate change. And I think I have absolutely no doubt, me and all the other thousands of scientists who've looked at this, that climate change is real. It is happening, and we are beginning to feel it now. And there's going to be no aspect of your life more influenced by climate change, unless you live in Bangladesh. It might be a little different, but if you live in Iowa, there's going to be no aspect of your life more affected than agriculture and where your food comes from. We had completely undependable weather last year. When it should have been hot, it was cold. When it should have been dry, it rained. When it should have been warm, it was snowing. It was muddy all the time. We had a lot of diseases. We had a lot of insect problems. We had absolutely terrible time getting crops in and out of the field. And we had massive amounts of soil erosion because of excessive rain. And that was on a farm that's farmed pretty carefully to prevent soil erosion. So we know that there's going to be massive erosion this spring coming up too, all over Iowa because of the huge amount of snow and all the moisture that we're expecting between now and when the ground thaws. So I fear climate change, and I don't know if we're up to it, to tell the truth. It's pretty frightening. The other thing I think quite a lot about is fuel. You might like to think that my little organic farm in Mount Vernon, Iowa, with a little hippie lady running it and the college kids helping her, might be all pretty pure, but it's not. We're totally dependent on petroleum. We don't use as much as everybody else uses. uses, but certainly we have tractors, and we run electricity to run coolers, and we depend on vehicles to get our food to town. So there's a huge amount of petroleum involved in any farm operation, even one that has pretty heavy on-hand labor like mine is. I'm also concerned about the loss of neighbors. Within a few miles of my home, I've lost about a third of my neighbors in the last 2 years. So one family imploded, and one guy got thrown off the farm. One guy died, and one family bought a better farm with a better house, and so they moved out of their old house with the bad windows to a better house on another farm. So they're gone now too. So if you go within a half mile of my house, all of the ground farmed all around me, the hundreds of acres around me, is farmed by only 2 different people. And they're very, very big farmers. They have a lot going on. They have a lot of land to take care of. I depend on neighbors sometimes to do some heavy tillage for me, so to do some work in the soil that my small tractors aren't able to handle. I have to have neighbors to help me. I almost don't have a neighbor who can do that anymore. In fact, today I was on the phone all day trying to find somebody who can haul 250 bushels of corn to Shellsburg for me, which is about 40 miles. And I don't have a neighbor who has anything smaller than a semi. Everybody who had a 250 bushel truck, it's sitting out in the junkyard and it doesn't run. Because they don't need a 250 bushel truck anymore, because they never would handle that small amount of grain. So I'm concerned about the loss of neighbors, and I'm concerned about the loss of knowledge of young people who are not going into farming. And I'm concerned about loss of genetic diversity. As farmers get bigger and bigger and bigger, they have to have varieties of crops that are easier to take care of and more dependably able to yield through climate stress. And so genetic resources for corn and soybeans are being concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer and fewer companies. Fewer and fewer traits are thought to be important now. And I worry that as climate change comes, we're going to need to have some ancient genetics around to help us, and we might not have them anymore. I'm also concerned that at all levels, including my county supervisors, the state legislature, and the federal government, bad decisions are going to be made on policy that's going to make it harder and harder for us to grow food in the future, when it's going to be harder and harder to do, just because of climate and the disruption of resources that Fred talked about. I'm afraid that we're making it hard for young people. We're making it hard for people who want to try something different. And we're sort of closing doors that might remain closed for a very long time, maybe permanently. For example, there's federal legislation, very well-meaning, with all the right idea behind it, to improve food safety in particularly leafy greens. And you all probably remember 2006, the spinach, and we couldn't eat spinach in this country. And because of that, there's been a nationwide effort really to improve the safety of leafy greens. And so the legislation has been written by the company that produced the leafy greens that had the poop on them, and they've helped to write the legislation. And the legislation fits a company that processes 4,000 servings of bagged spinach, or 4 million servings of bagged spinach a week. And the legislation is going to work perfectly for them and improve food safety, but it's going to drive me out of business because I can't do it. So I'm concerned that well-meaning people trying to do the right thing are making policy that might make it hard for all of us to have safe and healthy and local food in the future. And finally, what can I do about it? I can conserve, so I can learn to figure out ways to manage my farm so that we depend less on fuel. Certainly, I can grow my own nitrogen by growing crops that take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into a form that plants can use. I can then till those plants into the ground, and that can be nitrogen for my crops. And I can learn new ways to even make my ecosystem function even more efficiently and more tightly as a closed system. I also think one of my very important jobs is to train young people to be farmers. I'm reading a book right now. Well, actually, going around the country and around Canada for the last couple of years, there's been this speech and this line about we're going to need 50 million farmers. When diesel fuel is $12 a gallon, or when diesel fuel is $60 a gallon, or whatever it is, we're going to need 50 million people to grow our food. Well, there's 300 million people in the country, so that's every sixth person will be involved in growing food. I think it's a pretty good idea. I kind of like it. But I'm reading this book now where they think that idea is wrong. They think we need 100 million farmers. So that's 1 in every 3 people being farmers. And certainly, I actually think that's probably going to be important within your lifetime. And I am very happy to see young people who want to be farmers, and I think it's part of my job to pass on the knowledge about how to do it. And then finally, the last thing I can do is invest in my community, because certainly when diesel fuel is $12 a gallon and gas for your car is $18 a gallon, we're not going to be running back and forth to Cedar Rapids or to Iowa City or to Des Moines very much, and so I'm going to need to live in a community that can do for itself what the things that we need, food and shelter and education, the things that we need. So I'm looking for ways that I can build up my community as I go about farming my farm.
Thanks, Laura. It was interesting to hear a little more about your farm. And it seems like some common themes coming out here about the end of the cheap fossil fuel era and about climate change effects. I would like to, and Fred did a great job of laying out the history of policy. I'd like to start with the more recent time and look at where we are and what things we need to be thinking about more now. Well, first of all, though, just to reiterate that our current industrial agricultural system is totally dependent upon cheap fossil fuel. If you just drive down the highway in the summertime, you can see that this could not happen without cheap fossil fuel energy. And so that's the key thing that we don't really think about much in agriculture. Look on the state level or the national level, there's not much talk about what's going to happen to agriculture when we get to the end of this cheap fossil fuel energy. So it's time for us to start thinking about that. And Fred pointed out that that the industrialization was slow to come into agriculture. The Industrial Revolution started about 250 years ago in England, but it was only like in the late 19th century that crop production became fully industrialized. And animal production, the big confinement animal systems that you see around the countryside now, really only came into being like in the 1980s or after that. So because agriculture works with an ecology, it's hard to control all the variables of an ecology, and it took a long time sort of for agriculture to figure that out. But the interesting thing is that historical pundits tell us that about the late 19th century, about 1980s, is when we switched from the industrial era to the information age. And it's ironic that agriculture just kind of became fully industrialized just in time to be obsolete, really. And so, but what does the information age mean to agriculture? It means knowledge of ecology. Now we have a lot more knowledge about ecology, the life cycles of plants and insects and diseases, so and fertility cycles. So we can, by using certain mixes of crops, we can avoid the need for certain fertilizers, like Laura said. And by we can also avoid the need for insecticides and pesticides of various kinds. So with this knowledge of ecology, we can get beyond this industrial era, I think, if we use it smartly. And I want to compare, if we're going to try to model agriculture on ecology, let's look at that model of an ecological agriculture versus an industrial agriculture. And a natural ecology is characterized by diversity. Look at the prairies. Northern Iowa is said to have the most productive soils in the world. But if you think 12,000 years ago, when the last glacier receded from there wasn't any soil at all. It was a barren wasteland, geologic wasteland. It was only when plants and animals began to colonize and grow that it began to create soil. And soil is really geologic material with organic matter in it. So for example, when the prairie grasses would grow tall, they're famous for how tall they grow, and the huge root system, then the bison would come through and graze off the grasses, and the grass would be short. It didn't need all that root, and so it would slough into the soil a portion of the root system. Then it would grow tall again and grow a new root system. And then the buffalo would graze it off and they'd slough it back in again. And so that's how we got these deep soils by the organic matter being put deep in the soil. And so we can use those kind of principles in agriculture. For example, on my farm, it's a grazing dairy farm. I have about 180 acres split up into 60 small cells, pastures, we call it paddocks. And so we mimic that process that the buffalo use, where twice a day we give the cows a fresh section of pasture, and they move all around the farm, and then when they move to the next pasture, the original one regrows. And so we're rebuilding our soil in this way. If you compare that with our cropping systems that are prevalent since about 150 years ago, they've in a sense used up our ecological capital. We've lost about half of our soil to erosion in the last 150 years. And of the remaining soil, we lost about half of the organic matter to oxidation. So we've really lost a lot of our ecological capital in the last 150 years. But we can rebuild that if we model our agriculture on natural ecological systems. So, but in an industrial system, the diversity of nature is replaced with monoculture. One crop in one place. It could be thousands of acres of wheat in Montana, whatever. In Iowa, we have all the corn and soybeans. And when you have just one crop in one place, it takes a lot of inputs compared to the prairie, which grew and created the soil with no inputs, no fertilizers, no pesticides. When you have a monoculture, you have to have herbicides to keep the weeds out, so you have only one crop. You need insecticides to control the insects that will attack that one crop, fungicides, other insecticides and fungicides and herbicides, as well as many fertilizers to grow that crop. And it's very then energy intensive. And also, in industrial monoculture tends to leak because in a natural ecology there's no pollution. The waste of one species in an ecology becomes food for other species, and everything is cycled and recycled, and it creates that robustness, and it uses everything. But in a monoculture with one species, we tend to easily lose, and we tend to easily leak. And so we know that the hypoxia zone in the Gulf of Mexico is to a great degree the result of leaking of nitrogen out of corn and soybean production in the Midwest that goes down through the tile drains and down the river and into the Gulf of Mexico and causing the algae to grow. So it's a leaky system. So if we can go to a more ecological system, we can solve many problems. And to solve these, to really meet these challenges of escalating energy costs and climate change, what we need is three things really. One is more resilient cropping systems. Another one is more energy efficiency in agriculture. And the third is to produce energy on the farm. And these three things can kind of work together. For example, now we produce some biofuels with corn. We produce ethanol. And actually we use a third of the national corn crop to produce ethanol. But we're not using that very efficiently. We're using it to run cars down the highway. And the average mileage of cars going down the highway, if you throw the SUVs in there, is 22 miles per gallon. And so we're not using that biofuels very efficiently. As a matter of fact, the ethanol that we use, it produces about 10%, almost 10% of the fuel that we use for cars. If we were to increase our car mileage by 2 miles per gallon, that'd be about 10%, from 22 to 24. And so you can see that'd be very easy to do. I drove up here in a hybrid gained about 44 miles per gallon. That's already old technology. We could double our mileage of cars going down the highway. So my point is that we don't really, we aren't using that ethanol very efficiently. And we should look to ways where we can use biofuels make biofuels on the farm to power farms. And if we can do it with perennial crops, it would be a great advantage because corn and soybeans are not very resilient crops. They only grow for about 5 months at most during the year, and during the other 7 months of the year, the soil is not protected from erosion very well and from leaching of nitrogen. But if you have a perennial crop on the land, like the prairie grasses, for example, they will grow for much longer during the year and will protect the soil. So if we can convert our biofuels to perennial crops, and there is a new technology coming online called pyrolysis. It's actually very ancient. It was used in ancient times, but it's being refined and developed. It needs a little more development. But pyrolysis, if you haven't heard of it, is a technique of making fuels by taking biomass and heating it to a high temperature with no oxygen. And it produces gaseous and liquid fuels and biochar, which is a soil amendment. But these fuels then can be made into diesel and gasoline. So just imagine for a minute, if we could have on farms, we could have an area that's perennial crops that could be made into fuel to run the farm. As a matter of fact, there's a company in Canada now that has a portable pyrolysis unit. It's not quite fully developed, but they're working on it. But it's portable so that you could, we think down the road, take it to a farm, make biofuels to run that farm, and then move to the next farm. And so it would be a way to generate energy on the farm. And of course, another thing is with wind. Now in Iowa, we have about 15% of our electrical energy is made with wind, which is really good. But most of these wind farms are in one part of the state, and they're to a great degree not owned by the farmers who have it on their land. And so the farmer is still paying a high retail rate for their electricity, and the profits go out of state in many cases. So what I think would be a better scenario is if we had maybe mid-sized wind turbines on farms all across Iowa. And then as the wind blows across the state, we'd have more even production, and then electricity could be used more locally, and it would be a profit center for farmers, and it would power the farm, and the farmer wouldn't have to then pay electric, retail rates for electricity. So if we can combine all these things, we tend to in this country often think of a silver bullet for policy, that for example, ethanol is going to solve our problems. But we need to, as somebody said, instead think about silver buckshot, have many things that work well. Because we can see that the corn ethanol thing really has its limitations, and it doesn't provide a lot of profit for farmers. So I think we have to think more holistically, how we can keep profit on the farm. And because farming has become less and less profitable over time, more and more of the wealth has been extracted, but that's something we can talk about later. So just to summarize, we're coming to the end of the cheap fossil fuel era. Either we need to plan and create something for the future, or else we're going to run up against the wall at some time, and we're going to have to change by default, and then it's going to be very painful. I think I'll stop there.